Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome. Thank you for joining me this morning for site planning. Now, last week, I've discussed in extent about the internal site conditions and touched on a little bit about the need for site inventory as part of the site planning process. This week I'll touch on the internal data again, not too much, and then I'll also talk a little bit about external, as Pak Yusuf has already has already delivered some external site data or external or offsite influences, and how it all comes and how it all influences site analysis. In other words, we'll talk about on-site influences or internal data or internal conditions, and then off-site influences, maybe a little bit different to what Yusuf has taught you. It's more of building the sense of place and avoiding something that is known as placelessness. Okay. So last week I mentioned in great extent about context-sensitive planning and introduced to you the physical, biological, and cultural attributes within a given site. And I believe you're also quite familiar with. You should be familiar with this diagram. This is the diagram that I introduced to you yesterday. Not yesterday, sorry, last week. So existing conditions, and so site analysis basically takes your planning program, what you're planning to do, what are your goals and objectives, what sort of land use and activities that you're planning, and how do you go about phasing, as in the planning phases, and matching them with existing conditions, thus determining the site suitability. I also gave you an illustration last week on the many possible constraints and opportunities and how they affect the amount of developable area that you have. So a little deeper into site analysis, and site analysis is different. It's different to mapping. So site analysis goes well beyond mapping the site's existing conditions. When you carry out site inventory activities, you catalog and you map out each of the items that you enter in the inventory on your base map. But site analysis goes beyond that. Site analysis is the diagnostic or the diagnosis process that that identifies the opportunities and constraints. So carrying out site inventory alone is not going to help you in identifying the opportunities and constraints for specific land uses, but site analysis does. And the site inventory simply provides the physical, biological, and cultural data for this program-driven analysis. Some locations on the site may be unsuitable for development because of intrinsic physiographic constraints. It could be due to steep slopes, shallow bedrock, surface waters, and wetland. Other parts of the site may be suitable for development, but relatively inaccessible. And the lack of access could be due to intervening site constraints. So consequently, pockets of undevelopable land can render the original development program unfeasible. Whatever you thought you were going to do may become unfeasible because of prohibitive costs of perhaps extending roads and extending utilities to isolated areas of the site. So, and most of the times, it's these opportunities and constraints that you need to understand a little bit better, so that you can fully grasp the development limitations. And sometimes these development limitations become the reason to revise your plan or your program. So design influences also include existing on-site features that are retained, undisturbed, retained and undisturbed in the site plan. So a steep wooded slope, for example, a steep slope with woods on them, it is a natural feature that contributes to the site's unique sense of place. However, natural features can also be viewed as a development constraint that if you disturb those features, then it could have detrimental environmental or community impacts. It would have a very negative impact. So, for example, if you have a slope with if you say have a slope, where's my pointer jumps here and there, so as I mentioned, if you have for example, if you have a steep slope and it's overgrown with vegetation, in a sense, this could be a development opportunity. It could be a development constraint. Why is that? Well, perhaps it will give you a nice view to look at, but if you decide that that's going to impede development, so let's just get rid of the trees. So if you decide to get rid of the trees, uproot them, then at some point the soil can become unstable, and due to its steep angle, once weather conditions come into play, then you will have at first a surface runoff where you get unwanted volumes of water in your lower sites, or in some extreme cases, all the topsoil, the whole topsoil can come down and cause considerable harm to the community or to the users of the site. So at times situations like this calls for decisions that then would impact your original development plans. Perhaps that part of the site, at first glance, you think, well, that's a good place to put a water slide, for example. But considering the vegetation and perhaps even testing for soil stability, then you would probably avoid building anything on or even around this particular area or this particular corner. So you have to think, yeah, you have to think of features like this as as an opportunity to integrate green space or green infrastructure into the site plan. You might need to modify your initial plans, but it's for the best interest of everybody. That way you can also strengthen linkages between the site and the surrounding, or ecological linkages between your site and the surrounding landscape, because you're basically protecting, and perhaps even if you see a steep slope that is that you can introduce vegetation into it to stabilize, then perhaps it's a good idea to do, because you're basically restoring green infrastructure. And so remember what site planning is all about. Site planning is not just about siting or positioning different land uses and different buildings onto a given site, but also to enhance the site's potentials and features. So last week I mentioned several on-site development constraints, and I was wondering if any of you remember what those constraints are. You don't have to mention all of it. Each of you can mention one constraint. One or two constraints is enough. So I'll give you around 2 minutes to respond to this activity. You can join. You can visit classpoint.app. Use the class code 56309 to participate. It should take you around a couple of minutes to do. Wanted to know. Wondering whether any of you remember the development constraints that I mentioned last week. I probably should have given you more time for that, but that's okay. I should have given you more time, and so and thank you. But anyways, thank you for giving me the the opportunity to test out this tool. I just wanted to find out what you, I just wanted to find out how effective it is. But seeing that only 4 of you have joined in out of 11 or 12, but out of 11, 10 or 11 participants, I think I should have given you more time, and probably should have announced that I should have probably announced to join in to the ClassPoint app thingy. Anyways, um, two were mentioned: natural resources and ecological infrastructure. I mentioned several development constraints. So ecological infrastructure, health or safety hazards, which includes natural hazards and man-made hazards, physiographic barriers, natural resources was mentioned, historic resources, legal restrictions, and nuisances or disturbances. That's okay. It's not going to be graded. I just wanted to have fun with the ClassPoint app. So, as I mentioned, this week we'll focus on site analysis. However, I know the lesson plan calls for internal site conditions and internal site analysis, but I don't feel not comfortable. I feel that it's a bit incomplete if I talk about site analysis and not talk about the off-site and on-site influences. So we'll have a look at we'll talk a bit about the off-site influences or the external attributes. I hope it's not going to be a full replay of what Yusuf has delivered, but should be I hope it gives you a little bit of a different insight into what offsite influences or external into how external attributes can influence your site's development. So offsite cultural and biophysical features, they can potentially influence the organization of your site and the design of the buildings and the landscape overall. The number and location of entrances to the site, for example, are determined in part by the transportation infrastructure just outside of the site's boundaries. If your site is located a bit further inland, then perhaps you need to build, you obviously need to build infrastructure to connect your site to the existing transportation infrastructure. Adjoining streets, nearby transit stops, they can suggest preferred locations for new sites, and especially for new site entrances, sorry. Sites that are situated on a corner at the intersection of two major streets, for example, they do usually warrant a special design treatment. A new building's primary entrance may be located at the corner, and sorry, let's just do this. So as I said, if you have a site that is situated on the corner of an intersection, like so, major intersection, and perhaps this is your site here, and so the primary entrance perhaps can be located on the corner of the intersection. So perhaps, oops, I should have stabilized this. Perhaps on a corner facing facing the intersection right there. That way, it gives you a lot more. That way, it gives potential visitors better visibility of your access point. You could also situate additional access points near the site's boundaries, perhaps allowing for service access into the site. And then you might also need to look at land use regulations that can potentially affect your decision by perhaps some land use regulations may limit the number of vehicle entrances, and they may also impose a minimum distance requirement between vehicle entrance and the nearby street. So perhaps at some point after reviewing the regulations, then you might find that there is a certain amount of setback that you need to adhere to, thus giving a certain distance between your building and your building or the development and the access points. So you might need to extend the access points like so and so on. So overall, when we're talking about this illustration here demonstrates or displays the different how a site analysis is conducted on the external or on the off-site influences. Whereas you can see the primary development is happening along this area here, along this spine, if you want to call it a spine. So that's where all the development or all the action is happening there, and here you can see from this line. That's where the development access. Is. So anything within the development boundaries, of course, they're the on-site influences. But anything off it are the off-site influences, and I'll just show you a couple of them. So one of the biggest off-site influences is the cruise ship traffic lane. That's allowing visitors to this site to enjoy the views of cruise ships, big cruise ships passing by. The site's designer has also highlighted views to the lighthouse and the open sea. Perhaps this is a boardwalk over here that extends towards the water body, and the lighthouse is, of course, not on the site. It could be somewhere. It could be somewhere here, or it could be somewhere over here. But then there's a big uninterrupted view to the open sea. And then what else is there? That is what else out there? So perhaps even a theater or a large ceremonial. This is a ceremonial ground that this illustration contains, but perhaps it could be something else. It could be a theater. It could be a public square that is situated outside of your site. That then ultimately influences where you put your visual barriers. Perhaps because if it's a significant if it's a significant theater or a significant facility, then perhaps you wouldn't put vegetation on this area here. You would perhaps clear that area so that guests can have an uninterrupted view towards the ceremonial grounds or whatever they may be. But this apparently this site has existing the vegetation on this site are existing now. If they are existing vegetation and they happen to be endangered species or exotic species, perhaps then you instead of removing them, perhaps you need to uproot them and replant them somewhere else. So you're not killing off the vegetation, but it's more of moving them to more suitable locations on the site. So perhaps rather than blocking the view to this Clifford Park, perhaps you can plan for vegetations here. But then, of course, you're saying then of course you might impede a degree of views for whoever goes along this path here towards the sea. But that's okay, because visitors have the option to access the site along the walking path here. And if they want to enjoy the views, then they walk along down there up here instead. Other internal elements or internal attributes that can be a potential development constraint or opportunity are existing structures. In this illustration, there is an existing abandoned restaurant. I know of such situation a couple of them in Brisbane, Australia, where there is an existing abandoned restaurant. It was just sitting there. It's a large structure, and it happens to be situated in. It happens to be situated in a similar position, where the restaurant, when it was still active, it had a clear, uninterrupted view to the river, and visitors of the location would have to walk around the restaurant. So now, I think a couple of years ago, just before I left, the restaurant is no more. So they removed the building, but we don't really know what they're building there yet. Well, I haven't checked lately. So another example of an abandoned building or an abandoned structure is another abandoned restaurant, but this one is situated on the water. It was abandoned due to Brisbane's 2011 floods, and just a few weeks ago, when the city experienced another major flooding, the whole structure was actually displaced, and was actually blocking a cycling and pedestrian path along the river. So that was unfortunate. So such things again may be taken into consideration, or need to be taken into consideration when you are conducting your site analysis. So in essence, you in essence, other than existing elements, you may also need to also need to conduct a contextual analysis on how and why people use or avoid outdoor spaces. So you need to observe as well whether people choose to walk along this path rather than walk along this one, for example. And if you're seeing more traffic, in one area rather than the other, then perhaps you need to question, or you need to ask the question, why do they choose one path over the other? So and there's nothing there's no other method than to observe and interview visitors as they go by about your site. What else? So as I mentioned, the idea of what I'm sharing to you right now is one way to avoid a little phenomenon called placelessness. Now, placelessness is something that we all need to combat. It is a condition or a state where a particular site has no identity, has no character. I mean, it's there, it works, it functions, but it just doesn't quite draw you in. It's really hard. It's an unquantifiable term. It's an unmeasurable term, what place is. But it's just the atmosphere. It's just the vibes that you get when you're in a place. You know you are there. You know that you have arrived once you set foot on the site, or you know you've arrived even if you haven't set foot on the site, but just looking at it, you know that you are there, if that makes any sense. So again, because it's an unquantifiable thing, place is an unquantifiable thing. The sense of place is an unquantifiable thing. It is a bit more difficult to measure. It's a bit more difficult to observe, but you can look for indications. You can observe indicators for indicators of placelessness. For example, walkway connectivity. It's not necessarily just walkways. It can also be other forms of transport, perhaps other than walkways. It could be any other non-motorized. Goodness me, I need to design a better stand for this. Non-motorized, any other forms of non-motorized transport, not just walkways. Perhaps the walkways are there; they have good connectivity, but they have poor. But perhaps they have poor capacity. It's just too narrow. Or on the contrary, the walkways may be sufficient. Right? The walkways may be sufficient, but they are rather than being too narrow, they could be too wide. So rather than having people crowding throughout the walkway, you have people who are very widely spaced apart. That's fine in some circumstances. Nowadays, we do need to maintain a sort of physical distance to adhere to the health protocols, but At times, I think walkways that are too wide and too sparsely populated can induce a sense of agoraphobia. Other problems, perhaps you have multi users on the site. You have people using motor vehicles, you have bicycles, you have cyclists, you have pedestrians. And that sort of combination, or that sort of meeting between the different path users can cause conflicts. As we know, motor vehicles travel a lot faster. They're a lot bigger. They're a lot heavier. They're a lot bigger than bicycles. And certainly, I think the most vulnerable stakeholder in this situation will be the pedestrians. Vulnerable. So conflicts such as these then pose safety issues, with usually the pedestrians losing out. The pedestrians lose out to the bicycles, and the bicycles lose out to the motor vehicles. And if you have motor vehicles and pedestrians in one spot, then pedestrians usually lose out to the motor vehicles. So perhaps when you're planning or designing a place like this where there are potential conflicts, then you might look at traffic calming measures for motor vehicles. So reduce their speed, or perhaps get rid of them altogether. So no motor vehicles. Still, conflicts among cyclists and pedestrians can occur, with cyclists generally carrying a lot more speed than pedestrians, and pedestrians like to walk about. Sorry, and they don't really have a set pattern of moving about the site, do they? I have had experiences with where in mixed modes of transport, or mixed paths, where I'm riding my bicycle, and then suddenly a tourist or a pedestrian would suddenly pull out in front of me without even looking left or right, and suddenly taking a selfie. So it's no matter. So again, the same strategy can be implemented with cyclists. It's a bit more difficult to monitor their speed, because it's a bit more difficult to monitor their speed, because even if you do catch cyclists speeding, and you want to go and catch them or find them or anything, but they'll just run away. So you might look at, but you might still look at enforcing speed limits and carrying out speed reducing or traffic calming measures. That way they won't be able to speed up as much. So in the hierarchy of mixed paths, the orientation is to provide the best experience and the best facilities for the pedestrians. Second best for the bicycles, and of course, lastly, you should provide the worst experience for drivers and other motorists. Simply because we have to look out for the most vulnerable stakeholder among this mixed path. Another indicator of placelessness would be vegetation, trees and other plantings. So ideally, ideally you would have sufficient vegetation along a given path, because vegetation do not only provide they don't only provide shade, they don't only filter out noxious gases, but they also have an aesthetic value to them. So if you have a bare path like so, empty it, like if you have a path like so, it's basically bare, with very few vegetation, maybe just one tree every I don't know, one tree every 100 meters or so, then that's certainly not going to give not going to give enough visual comfort, enough thermal comfort for the visitors. So ideally, you should have a good mix of covered paths, and perhaps, but you don't have to cover all of the path. So you might have vegetation covering one part, and you might have a certain part of the path open. You might leave it open and then provide artificial shading through pergola or some other man-made structures, and then leave another section open. Then continue with the vegetation. Lighting is the other factor, or the other indicator. Again, if it's insufficient, then your path will be pretty dark and grim. So perhaps one or two street lighting would be sufficient for a path. You're not going to have too many dark spots. But then if you have insufficient lighting, so for example, this is your path, and here is the only light for the next 50 or 100 meters, and then you have overgrown vegetation on one side, and perhaps even more vegetation on the other. It might not be an issue during the day, but in the evenings, then these features can potentially be it can be a potential threat. To visitor safety. Someone might be lurking behind the vegetation and looking for an opportunity to jump. So what about adding more lights? Well, maybe you decide to add a bit more light here, a bit more light there, and another lamp post here. You might create excessive outdoor lighting. But you're not going to turn them on during the day anyways. Yeah, okay, that's fine. During the day is fine. Lighting or outdoor lighting can only be observed in the evening. And it's one thing to provide sufficient lighting. It's another thing to have excessive lighting, where the artificial lighting can potentially induce glare. It'll cause glare. And finally, it's the provision of site furniture. Park benches, think park benches, think park benches, and think rubbish bins or other waste facilities. Think perhaps if you're providing a bike path, then you might have a bicycle repair station where cyclists can at least pump their their tires every so often, or what other form of outdoor or site furniture could be there. So that some shading, perhaps in the form of pergola or any other structure to provide shade. So all of this indicates, or will not indicate, because again, placelessness, or the sense of place is an unmeasurable, unquantifiable thing, and your idea of a place, your sense of place and my sense of place can be different, but at least by providing sufficient infrastructure and anything that can enhance the site's comfort for its users, for its visitors, then you could potentially reduce the sense of placelessness. So, speaking of conflicts, conflicts doesn't only occur on site. Conflicts can exist between on-site and off-site activities. And so these must also be addressed. When you're choosing a site to develop, or when you're given a site to develop, it's one thing to be inward looking and looking at what you need to do, but it's another thing also to look at what's going on around your site. What other activities are there? If it happens to be an empty site, then that's one less concern. But if it happens to be a busy area, say in this illustration, where there's like in this illustration where there's a park, a neighborhood, there's a park in one section, and then a shipping, utilities, and recreation area on one section, a harbor front on another section, transport-oriented development in another section, and then we have neighborhoods that have water access in the other section, and on the other end is our green connections with cultural gardens and neighborhoods. Now, alone, when they're standing alone, these activities may not be potentially harmful in any way. But if you put them next to each other, then possible conflicts may arise. The conflicts may be more evident in maybe a lot more evident in in the border, in the site's borders, like so. So these borders, these site borders, require a different approach, a much different approach to other sections of the area that you're developing. So you may need, if you happen to own, or your client happens to own the entire site, the entire development, that's good. But if say Edgewater Park and Old River Channel are two different owners, then you need to coordinate with Old River Channel. If you're working on Edgewater Park, then you need to coordinate with Old River Channel to determine how to approach the area that you share, and what best way can you connect the two different areas. Same here, the Old River Channel owners should also talk to the harborfront owners, so that they can find an approach or a strategy that best fits their the area, the particular borders that they share. and so on and so on and so on. Why is that important? Because one activity can prove to be a nuisance to the other. So, for example, here we have a park and neighborhood connections area, basically translating to something that is family friendly, great for picnics. But here we have shipping utilities and recreation, a balance of shipping utilities and recreation. So I assume that Old River Channel focuses on shipping utilities. The recreation bit is the buffer that they introduce, they introduce within the border of their site that meets the Edgewater Park. So perhaps in the heart of Old River Channel is the shipping utilities activity, but over here then they have more recreation oriented activities. Same here, because in Harbourfront there's public access, community access, and downtown development. So this is the access. This is an access to the city's downtown area or the CBD. Therefore, that calls for a different strategy as well. So perhaps the recreation areas for Old River Channel is not just where they meet Edgewater Park, but also where they meet with Harbourfront, because that's where public access and community access is situated. And I think the same goes with all the other functions and all the other sections of the entire site. So in short, when conflicts do exist, program elements can be arranged to mitigate them. So you can situate users that are less sensitive to these nuisances to be located closer to the nuisances than other users. In either case, it's a good idea to provide screening and buffering, to introduce screening and buffering structures or strategies. It could be introducing walls, it could be introducing fences, or even vegetation. To help mitigate or reduce the unwanted unpleasantries. So I've been talking about constraints. I talked about opportunities as well, but I think just a couple of the last couple of slides, I think I've talked about more constraints. But just remember that a site analysis focuses on more than just the constraints, but funnily enough, that I think it's best to actually emphasize on the constraints rather than the opportunities alone. Best to focus more, best to prioritize on the constraints more than the opportunities. Because constraints and the strategies to mitigate or to overcome these constraints, they are more than enough to justify your efforts. They're more than enough to justify the situation, the siting or the placement of activities and structures on your site. Amenities on-site and off-site may have significant social, economic, or ecological or aesthetic values. These can include specimen trees or scenic views to natural features such as water or landforms, landmark buildings, or other major cultural features. Amenities also include unique rock outcrops and historic or culturally significant buildings and structures. So if you have existing physical assets, historic buildings, rock formations, even if you integrate these physical assets within a redevelopment plan, you can maintain the site's sense of place, sense of history, and you can also use those existing assets to enhance future visitors' experience when they're on the site. So protecting natural and cultural amenities can also increase a property's value and make it more, making it a more desirable place to be. And when I say property value, it doesn't necessarily mean the property value as in the property's monetary value, but the property's overall, say, intangible values increase as well. And site opportunities include locations that are potentially usable for one or more project objectives, whether they entail real estate development, environmental conservation, or perhaps restoration, or a combination of these purposes. And when you put them together, site constraints and opportunities, as I mentioned last week, delimit the area of the site that can accommodate the project program. And again, you might end up with a significantly smaller amount of developable land after considering the constraints and opportunities. So here in this illustration, you can see that the planning team or the design team have identified several constraints, several opportunities in and out of the site. They've also highlighted the potential corridors or the potential access points through the area. Again, they're working around the opportunities and the constraints that the site possesses. Now, last week I also mentioned something about identity, I think, and how and the elements that can and the elements or attributes that it can influence identity. Sorry. So I think I also talked about neighborhood buildings and stuff. So coming back to that, might need to you should assess the following as well. So the homes and the streets, identify or assess community streets, neighborhood niches, and anchoring institutions. What I find interesting is narrow alleyways and neighborhood streets like in kampungs. They're usually a lot more alive than the large boulevards or the large streets in more luxurious estates. It's not because I do believe that it's not because the rich are snobs, no, but I think it's due to the fact that it's usually kampung streets have a bigger opportunity, or have a bigger I wouldn't say potential, but they have a larger possibility of becoming community streets simply because of their size, their dimension. They're not too wide, therefore motorized traffic is not usually not too the motorized traffic is usually slower compared to, say, a wider two-way road. Another thing is because of the plot sizes or the lot sizes. Most of the houses in densely populated areas are quite small. therefore providing perhaps limited area or limited space for leisure. So when that happens, then people usually pour outside onto the streets, and they congregate around on and around the streets. That's why there's usually better interaction and better community coherence, rather than living in a larger lot of land. And because most of the times, I think leisure activities and leisure and relaxation can be had within the comfort of your own home. So there is no need to pour out onto the streets and interact with others, not because they don't want to know their neighbors, but simply because the street design itself is uncomfortable, or does not support this sort of activity. You want to go and talk to your neighbors, but then you want to talk to your neighbors. Your neighbor wants to talk to you, but then you have cars, motorcycles buzzing about in high speed and causing a lot of noise. So then you think, bother it, I'll just stay at home instead. So it's not because of the internal household factors, but that's how I would describe how the influences of street design and street dimensions can influence the overall neighborhood quality. I'm not saying that all streets should be narrow alleyways. No, but just comfortable enough to generate interaction among people. And anchoring institutions, well, that means this little bit here. Perhaps you'd have to investigate a bit further. Anchoring institutions usually entails the site's historic value, where history, its significance. Pardon my excellent handwriting. History, significance, and perhaps there are perhaps because of the historic significance, then there are organizations or institutions that work to preserve the site's history and historic significance. So that's something that you might need to, that you not just might need to explore. You might need to explore that on the site, but you definitely need to research that part of the site as well. So, what is site analysis? Well, site analysis is simply is simply finding out whether your particular site is suitable for development. Environmental conditions should principally inform land use planning decisions. Suitability analysis is the process of determining the fitness or the appropriateness of a given lot of land, tract of land for a specified use. Now, suitability analysis is spatially explicit, and most of the times they are program dependent. And because land development can create significant offsite impacts that impose economic and social costs on others, context-sensitive site planning seeks to minimize these detrimental impacts or externalities. Site suitability is a function Site suitability, therefore, is a function of the site's intended uses. So if you consider a partially wooded and hilly site along a small stream, several attributes could be mapped, but not all of these attributes will be relevant to the program under consideration. The site attributes most relevant to a proposed nature conservancy, for example, would differ from the site attributes most relevant to a proposed multifamily housing development. The analysis for nature conservancy project would place a high priority on identifying the site's plant communities, wildlife habitats from dry upland forests, slopes to lowland marshes and bogs. In contrast, the analysis for housing projects would place a higher priority on identifying areas without significant building constraints, which may include steep slopes, shallow bedrocks, and a shallow water table. So what I meant by that was if you happen to be assigned a plot of land for development, then if your, as I mentioned, if your objective is for natural conservation and preservation, then your activities will revolve around maintaining the vegetation population, maintaining and you will be observing habitats for endangered species, perhaps for little animals. I can't draw little animals on this, unfortunately. So you just have to imagine. That that's something cute and small, and that's something a little medium-sized, perhaps a squirrel or a fox. So vegetation and animal habitats and certain animal species are the things that you would look out for if you're developing a site for conservation. On the other hand, if you're considering the same plot of land for housing development, then perhaps the vegetation and the animals are of little concern to you. You might retain some level of vegetation, but you'd be on the lookout for site features like extreme slopes to avoid development. So extreme slopes would be something like this area here, where it's too steep for development. So you would clear out the vegetation on the more gentle slopes, where you can place buildings. Now, buildings I can sort of draw out here because they're a lot easier to do than animals. So that's more or less an illustration of the same site with two different development objectives and orientation. But either way, whether you're building for conservation or for commercial development, one thing that I think I mentioned this last week, but I'm going to mention it again. If you can, do avoid brute force engineering at all costs. Rather than using this sort of engineering, this sort of brute force engineering to overcome intrinsic difficulties, you might have a stream, you might have a channel running across your site, you might have lowland areas where there's the potential for water to gather. Rather than trying to overcome these with concrete man-made pipes and other artificial structures, maybe you should just leave them undeveloped. You might consider to leave difficult site features undeveloped rather than introduce man-made pipelines and such, and other forms of engineering. Now, refraining from developing in unique natural areas can be justifiable from an ecological and ethical perspective, and at some degrees, you can also offer some support from an economic perspective. You can say that it's too expensive to build or to manipulate or to engineer a solution, but brute force engineering should be avoided simply because protecting and integrating this sort of green infrastructure into your environment can increase community livability and property values, and while also reducing public expenditures for big pipe stormwater management infrastructure as pictured here. So residential development design therefore involves more than just efficient layout of lots, streets, and utilities. So typically the most profitable and the most aesthetically pleasing plan is one that takes advantage of the natural features on-site and off-site and makes these features neighborhood focal points. Developing with nature, I think, is something that a lot of site planners and architects, landscape architects, tend to look into nowadays. It's not just ethical, but it's also fiscally prudent. It's good for the economic value from the economic side of things. Not just for the developers, but also for the municipalities in which the development occurs. But all in all, taken all together, I think development that respects inherent environmental constraints, especially natural hazards, they should help you protect against protect you against natural threats and hazards. So it helps protect public health, helps protect public safety and welfare, of course. So once again, this sort of no brute force engineering at all costs approach also celebrates the site's unique sense of place. Now, on relatively large sites, especially where built elements will cover a small fraction of the parcel surface area, suitability analysis is an important step in the land planning process. Typically, this means assessing the site's suitability for development, which involves the construction of roads and buildings. In rural areas without municipal services, development suitability may also depend on the soil's capacity to accommodate on-site wastewater treatment systems or support special agricultural uses such as orchards and vineyards. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Where were we? Right, land use suitability analysis. Sites that are most suitable for agricultural uses. So sites that are more appropriate or more suitable for agricultural uses usually require fewer management inputs or fewer engineering inputs or fewer engineering interventions. They require comparatively less irrigation, less fertilizers and pesticides, less effort and expense devoted to erosion control and such and such. So land use suitability analysis. Land use suitability analysis involves the steps that I mentioned here. So identify first suitability criteria for each land use. First of all, before you go about and conducting a land use suitability analysis, you should reflect on what it is that you want to build there. Find out the criteria, the criteria to determine the suitability for each land use. For example, if you're building a luxury estate or a villa or a luxury resort, then what functions are you going to introduce to those resorts, to your resort? Are you going, so will it be a large towering structure, or will it be more, would it be a more low elevation, lower building height sort of structure? That really depends on how much your ground or your site can support. So suitability criteria for each land use, so different land uses have different criteria. You might need to seek out those criteria first before you go on about and determining whether they're or before you go on about the analysis. Conduct a site inventory, where you create an inventory and you map the relevant site attribute data. You need to pay attention, especially to the availability and the reliability of the required data. For example, for the last 2 years, the site planning class have been constrained to using remote means of site surveying. So because of the lockdowns and the travel restrictions. So for the last 2 years, site planning has been conducted remotely. There are pros and cons to that. The pros is that you can conduct these remotely. You don't have to leave your home. You can just open up the digital map and survey your site from there. The problem is, okay, map availability may not be an issue now, but the availability of up-to-date maps or most recent maps are an issue. If you rely, for example, on Google's database, if you rely on Google Maps or Apple Maps for that matter, then usually they use, for some areas, they have, I think their most recent data would be 2 or 3 years old. Big cities, not a big problem. They update that regularly, but for more rural areas, then you might come across older maps. So the map is there, but the reliability of the map is then questionable, because since it's a few years old, then there's a huge possibility that some things have changed on the site. So other things to consider when you're collecting site attribute data would be scale. do the maps or do any of the data exist at the needed scale? And if you need to purchase these maps or these data sets, can they be purchased affordably? Are the data current? I mentioned that already. Do they pertain to the suitability criteria for the proposed users, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, you identify and map locations with the attribute values that meet the suitability criteria. So you have the suitability criteria, and then you've mapped out the relevant site attribute data, and then finally you identify again, but this time you're identifying and mapping locations with the attributes that meet the suitability criteria for the particular land use that you're introducing. Now, throughout that process, you may assess several cultural and biophysical attributes or features. If the analysis is conducted within a GIS, I think you're also taking a spatial analysis unit at this semester. So you should start to get yourself familiar with a GIS application or applications, whether it be ArcGIS on Windows or QGIS on a Mac. If that's the sort of analysis, if you're conducting the analysis on those applications with attribute maps in digital form, then suitability maps can be easily generated for each proposed land use. Now, these maps can then be combined to create on a single map a synoptic suitability analysis for the proposed project. So the GIS data consists not only of maps, but also data tables that are linked to the points, lines, and polygons on the map. Sorry. Now, location and attribute information for each map unit is stored as tabular data, usually as a spreadsheet. And then the analysis of individual attribute layers then involve partitioning the spatial distribution of these attribute values and so on. So the primary objective usually is to find the locations that are either greater than a specified minimum or less than a specified minimum or within a specified range. So these conditions create suitable or unsuitable places for one or more components of your proposed program. To be honest, I'm not 100% familiar with GIS applications, so I'm not going to go too deep into the technicality of things. And you're already taking another unit to cover that bit, anyways. So. And then other than finding the spots that fulfill the criteria for development, you may also identify places or locations suitable for spatial buffering or proximity. That specifies a distance of one or more reference features. So the resulting area of a spatial buffering or proximity analysis are either buffers or perhaps setbacks inward or setbacks outward of the site development or from the reference feature. So conducting a buffer analysis is also used to identify locations that require protection from development or locations posing significant risks to human life and property. Buffer areas can also be provided for to protect important terrestrial habitats and climate adaptive mitigation, climate adaptive migration corridors. Again, this is as much as I can understand the GIS application and features. Now, although it is possible for you to conduct complex spatial analysis with a digital GIS application, a small number of analytical functions are usually most useful for site planning purposes. A site suitability analysis typically involves overlaying two or more attribute layers, as demonstrated by this particular figure. So this is a score grid of resource map A, another layer for resource map B, another layer for resource map C. Now the intersection and the union analysis are the two of the most common and useful algebraic functions performed on attribute layers. So what the software actually does is they take the different maps together, they overlay them to then produce a composite map, and you will then look at the values within the composite map and see whether they match, whether they are within the range that you've specified, or over or under, and so on. So again, because this is a digital application we're talking about, they usually function using the union and the intersection commands. So the description of the union and the intersection commands are there, but are there for you to read. But a word of caution. A word of caution for GIS users. GIS is a powerful tool to spatially analyze, a very powerful tool for spatial analysis, to analyze a site's physical, biological, and cultural attributes. But GIS is also very capable of easily comparing apples and oranges. So even when these comparisons can lead to erroneous conclusions, weighting schemes, you assign weights to the attributes. That way you can assign priority values to key site attributes to overcome this sort of problem. And although mathematically it is possible to weigh each attribute and arrive at an algebraic sum, sometimes the significance of the values may be questionable. So the tool is a tool. The tool will only give you a good result. The results that you get is only as good as the data that you put in them. So again, coming back to the issue of data availability and data reliability. So it all depends, it all comes back to the user and to the sort of input that the user gives the software. Now, suitability for a given land use can vary substantially with regional differences in climatic conditions. So, for example, maximum feasible slope gradients for housing development will vary with soil and geologic conditions and climate, of course. I think I mentioned that locations with sub-freezing winter temperatures are usually more limiting because of the dangers that icy conditions create for pedestrians and vehicles on slopes. So just imagine the steep gradients of cities like San Francisco. It would be very, very impractical to have those gradients, to have those steep gradients in a city with snowstorms, with frequent snowstorms and freezing winter temperatures. So speaking of slopes and grades, I would like to dedicate next week to grading, not grading as in evaluation grading, but grading slopes. It's a lot to take in, this grading section. So perhaps next week, if possible, we can start a bit earlier. So rather than starting at 7:30, I think we should start at 7. We should start at 7 so we can spend a bit more time. I can spend a bit more time on explaining the technicalities of grading to you, because it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot to take in, and I think in the last couple of the last few years, I failed to put together a more compact way of delivering the grading content. So we'll start next week. We'll start a bit earlier, and so for the time being, let's talk about assignments. Now I've uploaded the 2022 site planning assignment and evaluation terms of reference on the class. On our class website, on the classroom. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'd like you to direct your attention to this document for the time being. So I think Pak Yusuf has already mentioned that we will have not 4, but 5 evaluation components, midterm exam, and then afterwards we will focus more on the class project or the site planning project. Now with the midterm exam, I know that today is actually our midterm, but again, I'd like to conduct the midterm exam after I explain grading to you. Because I think grading is crucial. So we'll do the midterm exams sometime in week 10, maybe in week 10. So not next week, but the week after. But the second evaluation is a presentation of your project progress, data inventory, and then afterwards it's data analysis, and then the development of the conceptual plan, and finally the final plan presentation and a 3D movie of the site that you've developed. Usually the final plan presentation and 3D movies are conducted outside of class. How many do we have? Oh, no, that's not that much. So we usually conduct these either on week 15 or week 16. So okay, the task is normally done in a group. It is a group task, so no, it's not an individual task. So it's usually completed within a group of 6 to 7 students per a group of 6 and 7 students. So we should have about 2 groups in this class, and it's usually carried out according to a certain schedule. So Pak Yusuf and I have agreed that we will each conduct 6 weeks or 6 sessions of the class. So that's 12 sessions for 12 sessions for lectures, and then for the 4 weeks, for the 4 remaining weeks, you can focus more on getting the project done. So you're developing a site. Initially, we proposed for you to develop a site on an on-campus site. So develop ITS, develop the ITS campus in collaboration with the master plan team using master plan data. But I don't really know. I don't really know how far the discussions have gone. Don't really know how far the discussions have gone so far. But yeah, I'll have to ask Pak Yusuf once again. So, okay, the final submission is outside of the regular class schedule. So week 17. That's still within the. It's still within our evaluation period. So after the final exams, most of the times we're given 1 or 2 weeks to grade your assignments before we publish the final grades. So if we don't get a map of the campus, please prepare. Just in case we don't get a map of the campus, just in case we're not collaborating with the master plan team, find a location that you can consider the location empty, but find a location or find a site with an area of between 5 and 10 hectares. Ideally, it should be limited by a road or a highway as the site's borders and the site study area. Whatever location you choose, you can consider the location as an empty location. So even if there are houses there, you can consider that the houses are non-existent within the site, within the 5 to 10 hectares. But outside of that, outside of your site borders, then the study site should be in accordance to existing conditions. You don't consider them as empty. You will then need to survey existing environmental conditions around the location, land use, the physical conditions, topography, rivers, ponds, vegetation, etc. Modes of transport, road type, road class, transport circulation patterns, vehicle types, road conditions, etc., utility conditions in the region, and perhaps also social attributes there. And then you will also need to gather secondary data, land use regulations, land use data, topographic data, geology, hydrology. Think for climate, wind direction, and rainfall. It's something that you can get from the Bureau of Meteorology. Any spatial policies, regulations, and data, plans, RPJM, RPJMD, that sort of thing. And then you will conduct internal and external site analysis. You formulate your development concepts, and you then finalize or formulate a site plan concept. I think that the terms of reference also details the assignment progress during the data collection stage, during the data inventory stage, what sort of data you will need, what sort of data you should collect. Yeah, I think you can have a read through. I've uploaded the terms of reference to the classroom. You can have a read through it. You can have a read through it yourselves, and perhaps you can also discuss the the terms of reference with me. I think I've been asked to share the QR code again. If you happen to be having issues with the QR code, which I think a lot of students have been experiencing lately, that's okay. I've made a note of your attendance through through the participants list in our application. So I'm not going to share the numeric attendance code with you. If you're having issues, I'll just mark your presence anyways. I'll mark your attendance based on what I see on the participants list. There's not a lot of you anyway, so that's a good thing. If there were 30 or 40 of you, that's a different issue. Right. So, any questions or comments before I end this? Before I end today's meeting? All right then. If there are no further questions or comments, then wish you all a nice day. Do have a read through the terms of reference that I've shared in the classroom, and please contact me if you have any questions regarding the terms of reference and regarding the assignment. Have a great day, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you all again next week, where we will be talking about grading. And once again, we're going to start a bit early tomorrow. Not tomorrow. We're going to start a bit early. We're going to start earlier next week. So rather than 7:30, please be ready to join the class at 7. So thank you very much once again. Have a great day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.